what we found out was that in the middle of trying to comply with the 1 hour window, we also need to think around employee well-being.
On the one hand, you have HSPs like the ones we interviewed who are responsive and are easy to get hold of, but these are the companies that are already working very hard to remove terrorist content from their platforms. So the other option is to try and focus more on the companies that are harder to get hold of, harder to find, who are not sharing contact details, who are unresponsive when you try to reach out to them, who are not being proactive in removing content.
Hi, and welcome back to the Tech Terror Takedown podcast, where we explore the latest trends and challenges in the fight against online extremism and terrorism. I'm your host, Sophia, Rothut, a researcher at LMU Munich and in the EU-funded TAY project. Today we will be discussing the struggles and strategies of small and micro hosting service providers, or HSPs, in complying with the European TCO regulation. I'm delighted to be joined by two experts and much valued project colleagues today. First, I'd like to introduce Stuart Macdonald, who is a professor at Swansea University, co-director of the Cyber Threats Research Centre and coordinator of the Voxpol network, where he focuses on terrorist use of the internet and the legal challenges this poses. You might already know Stuart from our 4th episode, where we explored the role of AI in content moderation. Welcome back, Stuart. Very nice to have you here again.
Thank you for inviting me back.
Joining him today is Mohamed, a postdoctoral researcher at Dublin City University and an affiliate of the Cyber Threats Research Centre at Swansea University. Her research delves into radicalization, extremism, and gendered narratives in jihadist propaganda, as well as the broader prevention and counteraction perspective. Welcome, Miraj. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Today, I'm extremely excited because Miraj and Stuart will share findings with us from a very innovative and important study they just complemented, fresh out of the oven, so to say. Miraj, could you start by giving us an overview of the study, specifically what the aim and idea behind it was?
Thank you, Sophia. So the aim of the study basically was to understand more about small platforms, and we wanted to know basically how do small platforms work? What are their experiences of implementing the EU terrorist content online regulation? And also to basically understand more when they're trying to implement this particular regulation, what procedures and practices do they have in place in relation to content moderation? Because the regulation is basically about platforms being able to take down terrorist content within a short period of time in order to prevent it from disseminating further. And the main assumption basically of why we focused on smaller hosting service providers comes from the idea that smaller and micro platforms struggle. Yeah, there are existing studies that actually show these particular platforms have limited capacities, for example, in terms of financial resources, but also in terms of subject matter expertise. And therefore, while larger social media platforms, for example, have invested significantly in removing terrorist content online, terrorist actors, according to research, have moved their activities or basically migrated, and they're using smaller platforms to create and also disseminate content. But then smaller platforms often lack the ability to successfully respond to such activities in comparison to larger platforms, again, because of the resource issues. And therefore, the project seeks to understand what kind of challenges these platforms encounter when trying to comply with implementing the TCO regulation, but at the same time, research time and over again, for example, by Tech Against Terrorism, has shown that terrorist actors deliberately use smaller online platforms to disseminate and communicate their propaganda. And at the same time, there's also, I think, one research by Tech Against Terrorism that showed around approximately 300 different online platforms were actually being used for purposes of dissemination of propaganda. But at the same time, Europol has also shown this in their reports time and over again, that different online platforms are being used for these purposes. And therefore, the project is basically trying to identify those challenges that they face and work with other consortium partners in the TET project, like, for example, LMU, to develop resources that can actually help these smaller platforms in complying better with this particular regulation, but also basically make the digital environment safer for everyone, for users, for platforms, but other people as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Miraj. So how did you conduct the study, and which challenges did you face there?
It was a study that took us quite a bit of time. So basically, it's a qualitative design study that uses semi-structured interviews as a data collection method. And we started approaching HSPs sometime in July 2023. And together with other consortium partners, Tech Against Terrorism were very useful, but also LMU, we did quite a bit of an outreach activity there to try and identify different smaller and micro platforms. And the way we did it was basically, it was a very purposive sampling technique that was applied. We identified platforms that can be considered small and micro, and to basically arrive at these sizes, we used EU's Directive 2015, I think 1535, to identify like which platforms fall within the category of small and micro that can actually be involved in this particular project. And we approached 49 of such platforms, but were only able to secure 15 interviews. And there are several reasons or potential reasons as to why we ended up with such a small number. And I think one of them is because there was quite a low response rate, which is firstly tied to most of these platforms don't have their contact details on their websites. So we had to sort of fill in the general online form that they have there. And most often that was not responded to. But I think it's because there's so many emails that go to these organizations, some from their users, from people interested in their products and whatnot. So probably our emails were also buried in those particular emails, and we didn't get to hear back from them. But for others, I think it's also plausible that we were not able to secure as many interviews as we thought we would, because organizations, specifically organizations that are required to implement certain regulations, would be hesitant to participate in research activities for fear that that research could actually result in more regulations targeted towards them. So it's basically like adding more work to already a pile of work that you have to do. So I think that's also one of the reasons why we didn't hear back from them. And another final reason could be because some of these organizations are, as we say, they're small and micro platforms, meaning they have limited human resource capacities. So if they have smaller operational teams, it means they sort of have to prioritize what areas they want to address first, and research activities might not be something that comes at the top of their priority.
One of the key findings of your report is the significant challenges small and micro HSPs faced in complying with the TCO regulation. Could you walk us through the main obstacles they encounter, particularly in terms of legal knowledge and capacity?
One of the main challenges that was raised during the interviews was that they have limited resources. So, for example, operational teams, some of the organizations had 1, maybe to 5 people working within the organization, and they have a user base of around maybe 100,000 up to 300,000 users. So it actually becomes quite difficult for a very small team of people to be able to remove terrorist content online in a timely manner, but to also continuously go through the content in their platform to make sure that it does not violate any regulations. They also had capacity issues when it comes to subject matter capacities. So you find that these platforms, apart from having to deal with terrorist content, they also deal with content that results in other types of harms. Like, for example, they also have content relating to child sexual abuse material. and other forms of extremist, but also terrorist content. So I think it becomes sort of difficult to keep up with the language, for example, the slogans and the symbols that are used by bad actors. And I think from what we've seen in different other types of studies that have been done, is that terrorist actors are quite adept, I think that's the word, at sort of coming up with new symbols and slogans to evade moderation. So then you find that where there are no specific subject matter expertise within a platform, it becomes really hard to keep up with such things, including dog whistles as well. Again, on the issue of capacity, is that with limited financial capacity comes also challenges of accessing, for example, legal counsel, whether it's in-house or external. So having these sort of consultations to know, like as a small or micro platform, this is what is required of me. With the EU terrorist content online regulation, that also became quite a problem. Whereas if you compare, for example, with bigger platforms, they would have in-house legal consultations and way bigger teams that can actually keep them up to date in relation to different regulatory regimes. And one of the things that actually stood out was the study involved interviewees that came from all over the globe. Basically, they were located in different regions. North America, we also have individuals in the EU and also other countries. And you find that there's a difficulty in trying to sort of understand how the different regulations fit together well. So, for example, if a HSP is based in country X in North America, that particular country has its own national regulations. And then on top of that, you have the EU, which is a transnational regulation. So then trying to navigate how do these two regulations fit together nicely, or even how can I make sure I'm complying with all of them without having to prioritize one over the other. That's always a challenge. But even if you compare it to the DSA, for example, because this also came out quite a lot in our interviews, individuals were not sure what's the relationship between the TCO and the DSA, and do I prioritize the TCO or do I prioritize the DSA? And this touches also on the issue of legal knowledge. In our interviews, we found that actually most of the smaller and micro platforms were not very aware when it came to the TCO. And if they were aware about any EU regulations, then it was actually the Digital Services Act. So then there's also this issue of, about the DSA. And then we had to clarify, actually, this research is about the EU terrorist content online. And they had a tiny bit about the TCO, but not so much. And most of their knowledge had actually come from, for example, the TET project had done quite a good job at putting out information out there in relation to the TCO. So this was also something that was mentioned, that they got their information about the TCO from TET and from institutions such as Tech Against Terrorism and GIFCT. So then you find that while the EU institutions have been conducting awareness campaigns surrounding the DSA, still more effort is needed when it comes to the TCO. Like as much effort as is put into the DSA should also be put into the TCO. Otherwise, it becomes the forgotten sister regulation of the DSA. I don't think that's good, because if you actually look at the TCO, it has very close relations with the DSA in terms of making the digital environment safer, but also specifically when it comes to what type of content should be allowed online. Yeah, so some of our interviewees did mention that they have heard, for example, about the TCO, but from the EU Internet Forum. So this is an institution that has been conducting awareness raising campaigns on different regulatory regimes. So it was actually a useful tool, but at the same time, there wasn't what would be regarded as concerted effort in the same way as, for example, we've seen around the DSA. So I think that's something that would be very interesting to see in future. And just to make sure I'm not forgetting something, or rather the most important challenge that actually came out of the interview was in relation to the 1 hour removal window. So basically, according to the TCO regulation, is that when a platform receives a removal order from a competent authority, they have 1 hour to respond to that removal order. So to basically go through that particular content and pull it down of their platform. And this came out as being a big challenge, and it actually varied within the EU, but also outside the EU, because there are organizations that are located in very different time zones. So then we had questions of, what if the removal order actually comes in when it's at night and people are actually sleeping? Then we see it in the morning, it means that particular period has lapsed. And what are the consequences that are going to come out of that? So that was an issue of concern. But at the same time, it was more concerning because as we talked about capacity issues, smaller and micro platforms have limited human resource capacity. So their operational teams are very small. How do they navigate the 1 hour removal window? Should they prioritize this over other requests? But also it speaks to the question of, should they prioritize this harm type over other different harm types, such as child sexual abuse material, or what should come first? So I think that is something that many platforms had anxiety about. The organizations have probably found ways of dealing with this. My colleague Stuart is going to talk about that later in great detail. But what we found out was that in the middle of trying to comply with the 1 hour window, we also need to think around employee well-being. The amount of pressure that this particular demand places on moderators could actually affect their well-being. And we know, like, for them to be productive, but also to be effective at what they do and efficient, it also means there has to be a very good balance between work and health. Yeah. So this is something that needs to be thought at carefully, and to basically see at what cost and what remedies can be made, probably.
That's a perfect bridge to talk more about the 1 hour removal window. This 1 hour rule was identified as a major concern for smaller HSPs in your study. Can you tell us a bit more about what you found in relation to the 1 hour removal rule, and what advice you would give in that regard?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think the first thing to emphasize is that the platforms that we interviewed were really concerned to comply with the 1 hour rule specifically, and with the regulation in general. And there were a few reasons why they were really concerned to comply. Some explained that they thought it was good for their business. It avoids potential compliance issues further down the road. Others talked about the importance of being transparent in how you're tackling terrorist content online. And they felt that projecting this transparency showed confidence that the platform is safe for users. But most of all, the interviewees were intrinsically motivated to remove terrorist content from their platforms. They wanted to stop the spread of terrorist content, and so they had this intrinsic motivation. But at the same time, the 1 hour rule did lead to anxiety. There were concerns about their ability to comply. So interviewees shared with us concerns like, what if a removal order arrives while I'm on my lunch break? Or what if a removal order arrives in the middle of the night while I'm asleep? And this concern was particularly great for platforms outside the EU, such as North America, where the time zone is different. They were also concerned about exceptional events. What if we receive a really large volume of removal orders all at once, and we have to try and deal with all of them very quickly? So one of the things that the platforms had tried to do to deal with these concerns was to make sure that they always had someone available 24/7. So a couple of examples. One of the platforms, they had 6 members in their management team, and those 6 members took it in turns week by week to be available 24/7. Another company, the director of the company said that he just took responsibility for any requests that came in outside of working hours all of the time. And this then led to concerns about well-being. What is the cumulative effect of making yourself available with this degree of regularity on a long-term basis? So there was concerns about their own well-being, their employees' well-being. And also there were concerns that ultimately this could prove counterproductive. If you're struggling with your well-being and you're struggling to cope with this workload, then it could lead to removal orders receiving less scrutiny. It could lead to poorer decision-making when reviewing a removal order. And so it was no great surprise that some of the companies had begun to develop other strategies to cope with this. And there were two strategies in particular that interviewees shared with us. The first strategy was simply deference. So if a removal order came in from a competent authority, the company would simply defer to the judgment of the competent authority. They wouldn't scrutinise it or look deeply at it. They would just assume the competent authority had made the right decision and so remove the content. And this made it much quicker and more convenient for the company. And this coping strategy of deference went beyond just competent authorities. It also was evident in relation to things like Tech Against Terrorism's terrorist content analytics platform. If an alert arrived from this, they would just simply remove the content. And it even extended to AI content moderation tools. If the AI tool said that content was terrorist, they simply deferred to it and removed the content. And interviewees did acknowledge that this led to a risk of over-enforcement. And they were worried about this. They thought it could lead to a more negative user experience, but they felt it was necessary in order to cope. So deference was one coping strategy. The other coping strategy was outsourcing. So outsourcing specifically to trust and safety vendors. And this really is a growing market. It was very clear from our interviewees that they felt that demand for trust and safety products was going to just increase over the coming years. So outsourcing was quite a common strategy that was growing in popularity, but I think does raise some quite interesting questions from a regulatory perspective, because the trust and safety market is not subject to the same degree of scrutiny as hosting service providers.
Based on your study, what types of support and resources would be most helpful for smaller HSPs to better navigate and comply with the TCO regulation?
We gave interviewees the chance to share a wish list with us of things that they would like to help them comply with the regulation. And the things that they asked for broadly fell into three categories. So the first category was really about awareness raising before the regulation came into effect. So several interviewees said they would have appreciated more warning of the regulation before it actually arrived. And some said a kick-off event would have been useful. And a kick-off event, as well as helping them learn more about the regulation, they said it would have been nice to meet other companies that were in the same position as them. And this idea of a peer community of smaller HSPs was something that was quite influential. So awareness raising before the regulation started. And then secondly, information and resources on the regulation itself designed to make compliance more straightforward. So things like guidance on the relationship between the regulation and other regulatory instruments like the Digital Services Act. Resources on the scope of the regulation, so help with legal terminology like the meaning of terrorist content, and then other phrases that appear in the regulation that have been causing difficulty, such as dissemination to the public, or for companies outside the EU, a significant number of users, help with understanding this kind of terminology. And even just simple workflow or checklist documents that could be used as part of the company's compliance efforts. So these kinds of resources would be valued. And then thirdly, interviewee said that they would appreciate a authoritative point of contact, a national clearinghouse where they could simply go if they had queries and receive help, and importantly, receive help in their own language. And this was something that came across in some interviews. One of the challenges that we maybe overlook is that some of the companies are having to deal with this not in their native language, and they would value more help and support in their own language. So those were the three broad categories. And I think it's worth pointing out that some of the things I've just mentioned already exist. Some of them we've actually produced in the Tate project ourselves. So some of these resources do exist and are out there already, but there clearly wasn't awareness of them. And so I think part of the task here is to raise awareness of the resources and the help that is already available.
Finally, Stuart, if there is one key takeaway from your interviews with HSPs that you think regulators should hear, what would it be?
Well, as I said earlier, the companies that we spoke to were clearly committed to tackling terrorist content online. But it has to be remembered that they are just a small part of a much bigger ecosystem. So we've been doing some other work in the Tech Against Terrorism Europe project, in which we found more than 250 platforms that have been hosting terrorist content in the past 18 months. So there's a much bigger ecosystem, and the companies that we spoke to are not necessarily representative of this wider ecosystem. And in the course of preparing this study, we actually found that many of these other platforms are very difficult to contact. It's very difficult to find email addresses for them. It's very difficult to get hold of them. It's very difficult even to find out which country they're located in. And even if you can find contact details, you may well write to them and then not hear anything back. They don't want to engage. They prefer just to ignore the issue altogether. So I think this poses quite an important dilemma for regulators. Because on the one hand, you have HSPs like the ones we interviewed who are responsive and are easy to get hold of. And so on the one hand, you could focus on those because that's convenient. You're likely to be able to send a greater number of removal orders and have a higher number and a higher proportion of orders complied with. But these are the companies that are already working very hard to remove terrorist content from their platforms. So the other option is to try and focus more on the companies that are harder to get hold of, harder to find, who are not sharing contact details, who are unresponsive when you try to reach out to them, who are not being proactive in removing content. This seems like the part of the ecosystem that is more ripe for exploitation, but it's much harder work. It's not as convenient. You're not likely to be able to send as many removal orders, so you might have less impressive statistics. So there's a choice there for regulators to make. Do we want to go down the path of convenience that yields more removal orders, or do we want to take the more difficult route and try and focus on these unresponsive, hard to locate platforms, but then maybe not be able to send out as many removal orders in the process? So I think that's an important choice for regulators to make.
Thank you so much, Miraji and Stuart, for an incredibly insightful overview of the challenges smaller platforms face with the TCO regulation. It's been very thought-provoking to hear your recommendations on how we can move towards more effective and balanced compliance measures, and I'm sure your study will prove highly useful in the future. For our listeners, as Stuart said, there are already resources available which we will include in our show notes, so make sure to check them out. Also, be sure to stay tuned for more fantastic work to come from Miraji and Stuart. As always, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, take care everyone, goodbye.